The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees have taken their seat on the chair of Moses. Therefore, do and observe all things whatsoever they tell you, but do not follow their example. For they preach, but they do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens hard to carry and lay them on people's shoulders, but they will not lift a finger to move them. All their works are performed to be seen. They widen their phylacteries and lengthen their tassels. They love places of honor at banquets, seats of honor in synagogues, greetings in marketplaces, and the salutation, Rabbi. As for you, do not be called Rabbi. You have but one teacher, and you are all brothers and sisters. Call no one on earth your father. You have but one Father in heaven. Do not be called master. You have but one master, the Christ. The greatest among you must be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, but whoever humbles himself will be exalted." The Gospel of the Lord. Well, as we approach the end of the liturgical calendar, which always it starts with the first Sunday of Advent, which this year will be December 3rd, I believe, and it runs through till the Feast of Christ the King, which is the last Sunday of the year. This year that will be November 26th. And during this 4-week period, we get readings from the end of the Gospel of Matthew. Now, personally, if I were banned to an island and I was told I could only take one of the Gospels with me, it would be Luke. That's my personal favorite. But these 3 chapters in Matthew are my favorite parts of the Gospel of Matthew, chapters 23, 24, and 25. Now, what's going on here is Jesus is now in Jerusalem. The climactic of events of his life are about to happen. He's going to be arrested, he's going to be tortured, he's going to be hanged on a cross, he's going to be buried and raised from the dead. And so what we have is it's the final discourse of Jesus in Matthew, the final discourse, the final set of teachings. And they're essentially about what it means to be church. Now, of course, that's not the language they would have used, but that's what it means in our terms and our understanding. They're not the last 3 chapters, of course, because 26, 27, and 28 are the final ones. But these 3 chapters are of great significance. They were in Matthew's time and they are in ours. But there's something interesting about them. One is that most of the material in these 3 chapters is unique to Matthew. In other words, not found in the other 3 evangelists. Matthew, those of you who've heard me talk before, this is something I like to point out. The gospel writers did not know they were writing the Bible. Okay? They were writing documents that were addressed to specific communities that gathered to worship. And those communities were in different parts of the Mediterranean world. They spoke different languages, had different kinds of backgrounds and cultural experiences. Luke, for example, was writing to a congregation that consisted of Hellenistic Jews. That is, a Hellenistic Jew was somebody whose first language was Greek. They lived outside of the boundaries of Palestine. They lived, at least in Luke's case, the ones he was addressing lived probably in Asia Minor, what would be modern Turkey. And they were, although they were Jews and they practiced all of the practices, they read the holy books, they celebrated the holy days and so forth, they were essentially raised in a Greek culture. Greek was their language, that's how they were educated, they knew the Greek writers and thinkers and so forth. There was also a significant community of Jews who were Palestinian, more conservative, older. But Luke was trying to get them to see a world that was different. In other words, he was trying to take into consideration the real world that those people were living in. They were not living in Palestine. They were living in a completely different context. Okay? It was like for many of us, our immigrant parents or grandparents or great-grandparents came in from another country coming over to this one. They came into a very different world, and somehow or other, they had to adapt to that world. Matthew is writing to a different group of people that's focused mostly around or near modern Jordan and Palestine. And these were the more conservative, older, Aramaic-speaking Jewish people to whom Jesus ministered. This was the area where Jesus worked. And these folks were having some serious problems. We have to understand that the Gospel of Matthew was written about 85 AD. This is 55 years or so after the time of Jesus' ministry. Okay? The people who knew Jesus, by and large, are gone. Right? And what had happened, of course, around 70 AD, for reasons we don't need to go into here, Jerusalem basically was destroyed. The Romans came in and flattened the city and destroyed the temple, the center of Jewish worship for centuries before this. This was a great shock to Jews all over the Mediterranean world, but especially for those who lived in or near Jerusalem, to see the temple destroyed. And by the time the Gospel of Matthew was written, the political situation was this. Those Jewish people remaining, including the Jewish people who were Christians, okay, and don't ever forget, the first Christians were all Jews. Okay? But they did not see that being Christian cut them off from Judaism. They were Jews. Jesus was a Jew. He practiced Judaism. He preached from the scriptures, from the Old Testament. He celebrated the high holy days. He respected the temple. Okay? That's one of the reasons he drove the merchants out of the temple. He thought it was defaming the temple. Okay? So it's important to remember this. So you had this group of people who it's not a term they would have used, but we define them as Jews. They were the children of Abraham, the sons and daughters of Moses. All right? Different levels of belief and practice. Well, what had happened was, in the 60s of the first century, there was a period of rebellion, and the Romans were not good with rebels. A lot of people say, well, they were very tolerant. They didn't interfere in people's religious practices. That was true. That was very true, but it was still required that you be completely faithful to Rome. You had to honor the emperor. You had to pay your taxes to Rome. If you engaged in any kind of seditious behavior, you were in deep trouble. And the Romans, despite their reputation for being civilized, were breathtakingly cruel. The punishments that they devised for people who were traitors, seditious, crucifixion. One of the most horrifying punishments ever devised by the twisted mind of man. It's an unspeakably terrible, it was not only extremely painful, and people could be on the cross for days before they died, it was humiliating because they were hung up there naked, and in the Middle East, that was a sign of that was humiliating. That was to embarrass people. They did it on purpose because they knew that. All right? So Jesus was crucified because the Romans considered him a threat. Now, some would say he wasn't a threat, but nonetheless, they wouldn't have crucified him if he wasn't. We read in scriptures that he was crucified between two others, and they're often referred to, there's the good thief, for example. Well, they weren't thieves. If they were only thieves, they wouldn't be crucified. They were, somehow or other, they were seditious. They were rebels. They were people that just irritated the Romans. Okay? So what we have here is a situation where the Romans simply, as was their wont, this isn't the first time in their history that they did this kind of thing to a community that was in rebellion. And the one social group in Palestine among the Jewish people that survived were the Pharisees. Now understand, Pharisee, it's not an office. It's I don't know of anything you could compare it to in our culture today, but the Pharisees were maybe like a political party. The Pharisees were basically the most educated people. Okay, they were the ones who could read and write. It says the scribes and the Pharisees. The scribes were just that. They were people who could read and write. The great majority of the population couldn't. These were the high status people. Okay, the high income earners, the ones who lived in the big houses on the hills. Okay, and in some ways, they were pretty sharp. In Jesus' time, you had kind of the Jewish tradition, the Jewish practitioners, if you will, during this time, during time of Jesus' ministry, were basically divided into three groups. One was the Sadducees. The Sadducees were the old rich. Okay? They were the real conservatives. They were the graybeards, the stick in the muds. Okay? They didn't like any kind of change, political, social, religious, anything. I'm, of course, exaggerating a bit, but that's essentially the case. The Pharisees were the more open-minded. They tended to believe that the law could be reinterpreted. Different circumstances, different interpretations. The Sadducees said, no, if it says A, it means A, period. And the Pharisees would say, well, maybe it means A plus a little bit of B. They were more willing to adapt. But that meant they also were more politically adept. They could see how things were going, and they would be testing the winds, seeing how things could be changed and adapted in a way that would keep the greatest number happy for the greatest period of time. Well, after Jerusalem was destroyed, the Pharisees were pretty much all that was left. I meant the third group was the Essenes. We don't need to worry about them because they were out there in their caves by the Dead Sea. But they completely isolated themselves from the mainstream. But the Pharisees, after the destruction of Jerusalem, they were the one group that remained, and their decision was, united we stand, divided we fall. They're the ones who basically created the Old Testament. They're the ones who decided on what books would be canonized or were canonical, that what books should be considered the scriptural books. They wanted people to come within specific boundaries. And the people like the Christian Jews were on the margins. Well, those are the people who had caused the problems in the first place. So what the Pharisees did was they essentially had the local rabbis expel anybody who they might have been completely devout Jews, like Jesus himself, but if they proclaimed Jesus as Lord, they were to be thrown out of the synagogue. Now, again, we have to put ourselves in their place. It wasn't as if they could say, well, I've reached the end of the line in this town, I'm going to pack up and move someplace else and go to, Timbuktu or someplace and start over again. You couldn't do that. The place you were living was probably the place you were born, and it would be the place where you would die. The people you know, everybody you knew, you would have known your entire life. This was your life. If you were disgraced and thrown out of the single most important social institution of your community, the synagogue, you were totally cut off from everybody you had known your life. Family members, friends, neighbors, people you worked with, that was all gone. And yet you were there. You were stuck. Now you can imagine the kind of suffering that this would cause, and it created problems for the church. Because many of these Christian Jews were saying, it's not worth it. It's just not worth it. And Matthew was trying to encourage them to say, if you remain faithful to one another, those of you who are believers in the Lordship of Jesus, who have accepted baptism, then we can support you even if everyone else in the community abandons you. And he does this by trying to, through his whole gospel, his gospel is simply to say, Jesus is another Moses, but one greater than Moses. What was started by Abraham, by Father Abraham, what was reached to perfection in Torah under Moses, has reached its final summation in the person of Jesus the Lord. So to be faithful to Jesus is not to turn your back on Abraham, to turn your back on Moses. It's to bring to completion their work. It's finished. It's done. This new thing has entered the world. Okay? This is his point. But he also recognizes, the social reality. Now notice what he says here. I mean, this is some of the strongest, it's very different kind of language than what we would use, but it's really strong stuff. The scribes and the Pharisees have taken their seat on the chair of Moses. Chair of Moses is a metaphor. It just simply means they have authority. They're the teachers, they're the ones, the administrators, the ones who make the decisions. They have taken their seat on the chair of Moses. Okay, it's a metaphor, but it's a real thing. Therefore, do and observe all things whatsoever they tell you. What they say when they preach is truth. Do and observe all things whatsoever they tell you, but do not follow their example. There's nothing subtle about that sentence. For they preach, but they do not practice. That's it. That line has always been fun for me to read. I don't know why, but for they preach, but they do not practice. Well, you don't have to ask, what does that mean? It's perfectly clear. Okay? And then he goes on. They tie up heavy burdens hard to carry and lay them on people's shoulders, but they will not lift a finger to move them. So go out and do all the work, and we'll stand up here and applaud you. Okay. All their works are performed to be seen. They do what they do because they want the attention. Okay? All their works are performed to be seen. They widen their phylacteries and lengthen their tassels. Now, I admit the 21st century Pacific Northwest in the United States, widening our phylacteries and lengthening our tassels is not one of our problems. But you get the idea. A phylactery, you've seen, I'm sure you have, whether you were seeing them or not. It's a little box inside of which is quotes. It's sometimes the shame of the Lord God is Lord, and so forth. Passages from Torah, and it's put in the box. And then you take a cord and you wrap it around your left forearm, and the box is usually somewhere in the middle of your forearm like this. And then there's one you put around your head, and it's on your forehead. You've seen it. Well, of course, what very often happened was the people in positions of great power would have big phylacteries. My phylactery is bigger than yours, because I'm more powerful, I'm holier, I'm a better person, I'm smarter. I have a big phylactery, you just have a little one. Okay? The tassels. If you read in the Torah, in certain books of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, you'll find there's these regulations about tassels. You have to, for ceremonial prayer, if you see a prayer shawl, sometimes look it up on Wikipedia, look at it, find a picture of a pair, they have tassels on them. Well, in these days, the rich and powerful, the ones who controlled things, would make very long tassels, complicated. That's why you got this puny little tassel, that's from J.C. Penney, but mine is custom made. Look how big it is. Right? This was the thinking. Right? And they love places of honor at banquets, seats of honor in synagogues, greetings in marketplaces. Well, we all know people like that. We all do. Okay? And I think many of us have a tendency sometimes to wish we could be in those places. It says, and then he says, and they like being called rabbi. Rabbi, it's a difficult term to translate. It's usually applied to teachers, somebody who has teaching authority. It doesn't mean teacher, but it's usually applied to that. And he says, as for you, do not be called teachers. You have one teacher, and you're all brothers and sisters. To call no one on earth your father. You have but one Father in heaven. Do not be called master. You have but one master, the Christ. Now, again, these kinds of distinctions, what else are you going to call, the man who, provided the seed that created you? That's the term we use to say father. Does that mean you can't call your father? Does that mean the priest in his role can't have that term used? No, that's not what he's saying. The key phrase here is, and you are all brothers and sisters. St. Paul, in the 3rd chapter of Galatians, has a famous phrase, in Jesus, in Christ, he says, there are no Jews or Greeks. There are no slaves or free. There are no females or males. Now, of course, we know that's not really true. These kinds of distinctions are part of existence. It's how we organize our lives. These kinds of distinctions. There's nothing wrong with being a teacher. There's nothing wrong with being a father. In any sense, there's nothing wrong with being a master. That is, someone who is good at what they do and can teach and lead others. The problem that what Matthew is talking about, as what Paul is talking about, is here. Now, understand this. In one of the great failures, I think, in our tradition, in the specific Catholic tradition as well as the broader Christian tradition, is not understanding what church means. Church, the English word church comes from a German word, Kirk, but it has the same meaning as the Greek word, which was ecclesia. Okay? The ecclesia, in its original meaning, before the time of Christ, meant if you belonged to a town or a city in Greece, in a Greek-speaking community, the ecclesia was the gathering of the citizens. And when the citizens gathered, that was ecclesia. And why did the ecclesia gather? It gathered for liturgia. That is, to do the work of the city. This is what this is. And who has the power? Well, nobody has the power, or we all have the power. There is no distinction. When we are here, it doesn't matter what our racial background is, what our education level is, what our income level is, what our intelligence level is. It doesn't make any difference. It's irrelevant here. In the broader world, it has importance, and it might even have importance for our own sense of well-being. But here, it's irrelevant. Nobody here should be called by a title that sets them apart completely from the rest of the community, because here we are brothers and sisters, and no one is more than anyone else. This is liturgia. That's why we call it that. The church is not the building. It's not the pope and the bishops and the cardinals and the priests. The church is the gathering of the baptized. And there is nobody here who is less of a Catholic than Pope Francis. And he would be the first to acknowledge that. This is important to understand. And as we move through these next 3 Sundays, and especially the crucial Sunday, the last gospel reading for this liturgical year, which will be on November 26th, the Sunday where we celebrate the Feast of Christ the King, is the end of chapter 25 in Matthew. Material that is found only in Matthew. It is the material, it is the time, the point where Jesus gives his criteria for judgment. Now, again, in religion in general, and especially in Christianity and for us Catholics, religion is essentially about rules and regulations and doing this and doing that, or not doing that and doing this. This is how we perceive it. But in this passage, in chapter 25, starts with verse 31, and I strongly recommend you read this before the feast day of Christ the King comes. Jesus says what he will use as his criteria for judgment. We do not find this anywhere else in Scripture. Now, we find criteria for judgment. Paul has lots of things that he likes to judge people on. As the Old Testament has lots of material. The only time we ever hear this from Jesus is in chapter 25, starting with verse 31 to the end of the chapter by Jesus. And when that ends, we start with chapter 26, 27, and 28. This last discourse is Jesus just before he is to undergo his passion and death. And what does he say? Well, read it. But to sum it up, take care of one another. That's what he says. Take care of one another. If you take care of those who have need for what you can offer them. Take care of them. You do it to them, you're doing it to me. And if you don't give them what they need, you're taking that away from me. That's what it's about. That's the criteria. Did you respond to the sufferings of others, whatever it might be, however it might form, whatever class they may be, whatever relationship they may have to you? Do you respond to their need, their pain, their loss? If you do, you belong in the kingdom. And if you don't, you don't.